Hi everybody. In this video we're going to ignore PostgreSQL for a moment and just learn how to get a simple Node.js server working. So after we get that working, we'll add Node.js in the next video, but for now we're just trying to get that simple Node.js server working. So let's get started. So we'll be looking at two basic types of requests. One is a GET request and one is a POST request. And here's kind of the basic difference. If what we're trying to do is idempotent, meaning we're trying to do something that has no side effects, and particularly no side effects to the server, then we're going to use a GET request. So GET request relates to no side effects, idempotent. One main example might be a search request, right? If you do a search on something, it's not going to make any changes to the server or the database. We're just looking for information. POST request is used when there is some lasting change made, right? We're adding something to a database or we're deleting something. That typically is handled in a POST request. So remember those two differences. And these are general ones. There are exceptions, but for the most part, that's how we'll use this GET and POST. It also helps to think of this acronym CRUD. It's one that's used throughout industry. If you don't know it, it pays to learn what CRUD stands for. And CRUD is an acronym that stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. These are the major functions of persistent storage. So anytime you have persistent storage, you have this idea of you can create stuff, meaning add data to some persistent storage or add stuff to persistent storage. You can read from persistent storage, you can update the storage, and you can delete things. So there are equivalent commands in SQL to handle all these functions, and I'm thinking you probably know what they are. That's sort of why I left this table empty. I'm thinking that you can probably fill these out. And so go ahead and give it a shot. So we've looked at SQL in other videos. I'm thinking you have a good idea of how to do this. So SQL statement insert is how we add data to an SQL table. We read information by using a select statement. We update using update and delete using delete. Those are pretty easy to do. And those two verbs I just showed you also play a role in this CRUD and other verbs as well. So when we create something, that makes a change to the database. So we use a POST request. When we read information, that doesn't have lasting change. So we use a GET request. Update uses either a POST request or a request called put that I haven't mentioned, but we'll look at shortly. And finally, when we delete information, again, it's a simple delete. So it pays to look at things kind of from this CRUD perspective. Now, let's look at an example. Suppose we're creating a system that'll help campers reserve camping spots. So you have a camper van and you just want to go online, make reservations at different campgrounds or different sites. So we have this idea, we have code that's running in the browser, that's up here, and it's making requests to our backend server to see, hey, what sites are available, are there any, and if there are, I want to reserve a site. And imagine that type of web application. So the browser, on your behest, makes requests of the server, so it can do GET and POST requests, and that server responds back to your browser. So that's kind of the initial loop that we've been talking about. So, for example, we might go to campreservations.com/vacancy just to check, hey, is there a vacancy somewhere? That would be a GET request, so that's kind of a search of the database. So we'll do a GET request there, and that server will have some sort of response. Now, we just can't say, hey, is there a vacancy without saying, well, where is there a vacancy? So we want to pass arguments, and we can do that like shown here. So we say the campground, which is kind of the key. It's a key value pair in a sense. The campground is the key, and the value of that key is saddle. So this would be, say, is there a vacancy at the campground saddle? We can add more parameters or more arguments by this ampersand. So we can say the campground is saddle and date is 2020-12-25, or the start date and end date, or whatever information you need. So that's sending information to the backend server, and we're using a GET request. And just to show you this, so if I go to Google here and search for Saddle Campground, New Mexico, you see I already did it. But here you see that one of the arguments, there's many arguments using in this GET request, but one of them is that Saddle Campground, New Mexico. Sweet. So now let's look at the POST request. So let's say we see a vacancy at a campground and we want to make a reservation. So we have some sort of form on the browser side that it asks for our first name, last name, billing address, credit card info, campground, what dates we want, any other information that we may, how long, are we a tent camper or an RV camper or whatever. And maybe the site is campreservations.com/reserve. So that's a post request. We're going to make some changes. We're going to add this information into the database. So how are we going to send that information to the backend server? For that, we use what's called a JSON payload. So that post request is going to have a payload of JSON, and JSON is JavaScript object notation. And it's a format that's easy for people to read, as you'll see in a second, and it's easy for programs to process. And it consists of these key value pairs, right? So we have these braces, and within it we have the key and a colon, and then the values. It should look similar. You probably know it from other programming languages. So if you've looked at Python associative arrays or whatever, or dictionaries, they're pretty similar to what I'm showing here. So here's an example. So we have first name Ann, last name Mulkern, campground saddle, from date whatever, 2020, 12/25. And things can be a little more complex than that. So the value of a key doesn't have to be just a simple thing like a string or a number. It can be itself a JSON object. So we have first name and last name there. All right, so that's what happens. So we send that post request, and that post request contains a JSON payload to our backend server. So that backend server needs to know how to handle these get and post requests and how to process JSON payloads. And remember, that backend server sends a response back to your browser with all that information. Your reservation is confirmed or whatever. Thanks for using our camp reservation system or whatever. So it's sending information back to the browser. So what we're going to be using, there are a few options here in Node.js, but we're going to be using Express. It's a Node module that provides a minimal web application framework. We'll see what that means in a second. So that's what we'll be using here. And remember, we don't want to do anything using Postgres because we're going to kind of push off on that. So whatever we're going to be doing is sort of trivial, but at least we're going to get an idea of how we kind of communicate with a browser. So that's kind of the main idea here. And let me just give you an example of that. So here's just a very basic front end of this campground reservation system. And I can search to see if a campground's available. And let's say I want to go to Saddle. Whoops. And I search here, and it'll say 5 campsites available and give me some other information. I want to search again. And let's say I want to go to Apache campground. And it'll say 2 campsites available and give me a little information on that. So that's sort of roughly, without going into any database stuff, just some bare minimum stuff on the server side just to see how all this works. So the API we'll implement is this one. So API stands for Application Programming Interface, and how we're going to interact with this backend server. So we are going to create a GET request to vacancy. It'll take one argument, what the campground is, and it'll return a little JSON object, what the campground is, and how many sites are available. And we're going to fake all this again because we don't know, because we don't have a database, so we're not using this database server. And the other thing we'll implement is a post request called reserve, and that'll take some arguments like first name, last name, campground sites, and it'll return again just a reservation number 1, and then the campground and the name of the campground. So that's what we're trying to do. So here's the process. We'll first do kind of the preliminary stuff. We're going to create a directory, change directory into it. We'll do npm init. npm stands for Node Package Manager, and it sets, as the name suggests, it initializes things. We'll examine it in some detail, and then we'll install that Express module, which is what I just said, kind of a simple framework that will allow us to do what we need to do. So let's go ahead and do that. And here's my server running that was processing what we just saw here. And let me just quit that. Change directory up. I'll make directory reserve. Change it into reserve. And now here I'm going to do that npm init. Okay, here it asks you a bunch of questions. What do we want to name our package that we're developing? It's what version do we want? Let's stick with 1.0. I'm just hitting return here. The description, simple campground. As you can imagine, we don't have to do this. I'll call it server.js. And let's say there's no test command, no git repository. And the keywords are Node.js, Express. Leave that blank. Keep that. And then it just shows you what you're going to be writing to and say, yes, that's fine. And now let's take a look what happened. So it created this thing called package.json. And if we look at what package.json is, it's basically what you just looked at. It has just very basic information that we put in about our project. So what we've created so far is this package.json file. Next thing we want to do is install Express. Now if we look at the directory, it has Node modules. It's everything we just installed under this Express package. So let's take a look at that. So it provided a lot of code that you need to handle these HTTP, put, post, things like that. So great that we have it. Now if we look at package.json, you can see that now it added this dependency area where it says, hey, we just installed Express version 4.17.1. Cool. So that's kind of step one, the preliminaries. We just got things basically working. Okay, let's see if we can get the most basic server running. So the first thing we need to do is load in that module, that Express module. So now I'll create the app from the basic framework. So this will allow us some app that knows about how to handle GET and POST requests. So let's do that. So create an instance of that Express. Just going to set the port. It can be anything, but for me, I'll set it to 8080. I kind of like that as a port. This is pretty much boilerplate stuff that you would have in almost any Node server application. And now let's kind of do the equivalent of the standard hello world program. So one thing we can do is we can handle a GET request. So we've created this app on line 3, and now we're saying, hey, here's an app GET request, and we're going to handle anything that is to this address hello. And this is pretty standard. So we're going to take in a request. We're going to have a response, right? So as I showed in the previous slides, it processes requests and returns with a response. So we're creating a function here. It's an arrow function. And now I'm going to say what to do when a person comes with hello. Well, the only thing I'm going to do is my response is going to be some JSON, and I'm just going to return hello world. Pretty trivial of an example there. So now I'm going to kind of do the preliminaries of getting it started. And just type some basic information, console log. This isn't needed, obviously, but okay, I think that looks good. So we just say start the application. So that's what this app.listen is going to do. Once the server starts, I'll just print out, find the server at HTTP localhost and whatever port I have written up above. So let me save that and see if that works. I saved it in the correct directory there. That looks good. I'm just going to run node server.js. And now it says it's running on 8080. And here if I go to 8080, so localhost 8080, and I'm just going to type in hello up here. And it says hello world. So nothing amazing, but in a sense it is amazing. So now we've just got a server running. So that's pretty cool. So let's go on to the next part of actually handling this GET request, where we have vacancy. It has one argument, and we'll return this little JSON, what the campground name is and how many sites are available. And we're just going to kind of hardwired it. Let's say if it's saddle, we'll say there's 5 sites available. And if it's any other campground, we'll just say there are 0 available. Again, we're just trying to learn kind of the basic mechanics of how Node.js works with these requests. We're not doing any database actual work. So let's kind of get vacancy open. And the thing we need to know here is that rec.query is the JSON object that contains all the arguments that we get from a GET request. And the results we're returning, as we've seen, with res.json. So res results, rec stands for request. All right, so here we have the hello. Let's not get rid of that hello. What the heck? We might want a hello someday. So probably not. But we're going to handle a vacancy. And this is really similar to what we just did. So we have a request. We're going to have a response. And now we're going to have an argument for vacancy, right? We need to know, even in the simple case, what the campground is. And later on, we might need to know what the campground is, what the dates are, any other information that how many sites we want, so things along those lines. And these are stored in rec.query, what I just showed you in that slide. So let's just take a look. Our first example will be let's just look at that. So it's rec.query. So I'm just going to print that out. So we have vacancy here, and we'll just log rec.query. And you're right, let me just fix my typo. Vacant. That looks better. Let me save that. And let me quit my server and start it again. All right, so let's go back here. And instead of hello, I'm going to type in vacancy and give an argument. As you can see, it's still spinning because I didn't return anything, but I am printing stuff to the console. And here you see what it found. So from that browser, it saw the argument Q with the value saddle. And let's add some more arguments. Let's say, well, let's go with what I autofilled here because I tested it before. So date equals 2019, 10, 11, and 3 sites. Let's see how that looks. And you see I get all those arguments here. So regardless of what I put in, I could put in and movie equals Avengers. Doesn't matter what I type here. Whatever I type here, when I hit return, that's part of the GET request and is sent over to the server. So if I hit there, it puts all those values there. So this just shows you how the browser can communicate back to the server. It does it by these arguments of the GET request that I can grab by using rec.query. So here I am back at the API we want to implement, and we just don't want to be printing out this what the results of the query was. We want to get it's going to have one argument, a campground, and we're going to return that JSON object with the campground name and the number of sites that are vacant. And as I mentioned, just for making life easy, we'll have it so that if it's the campground saddle, then we're going to return that there are 5 sites vacant. And if there are, if it's any other campground, we'll just say it's 0. All right, so let's do this. Let's implement that API. So we saw that rec.query had key value pairs within it. So if we want to get, let's say we want to get that campground argument. So it's rec.query, then dot whatever key we're interested in. So for example, if it's here .q, we would get the value saddle. If it's .date, we'd get this date. .sites, we'd get the sites. So the syntax is rec.query dot whatever key we're interested in. So in this case, it was Q. And now we want to do that simple, trivial thing that if it's saddle, we'll say there are 5 sites available, else we'll say there's 0. So if and we're going to have this response, res.json, and the campground is that constant campground, and the sites, I think that was the argument, and sites are 5. Cool. And let me just do a copy paste here. There's probably a better way of writing this, but let's just go with it. And otherwise, it's just going to be, we're going to say it's 0. So I think that'll work. Let's give it a shot here. Let's quit this. Well, that's encouraging. There are no errors, at least obvious errors. And let's say we want obviously that, saddle with a capital S. So we're looking, is there a vacancy on saddle? Yes, it said sites 5. That looks good. And let's try looking for Apache. Site 0. So that's sweet. So we did manage that fine. So it was fairly easy to do. So we just had this kind of boilerplate that we use almost all the times. We load in the Express module. We create this app that knows how to handle requests. We set the port of that app, and we implement a bunch of these GET requests. We implemented a hello GET request and a vacancy GET request. And I would guess that you can figure out kind of the start of how to handle a post request. And if you're thinking app.post, you'd be correct. So we'll look at that next. So for the post request, we have that idea of a JSON payload that contains all the information. It wasn't in that URI of up above. It was an actual, it was part of the body of that request. So we need just a few kind of preliminary things again. One is that we're going to load in this module that knows how to handle this JSON payload. So that's first loaded in, then we say, hey, use it, and then we'll learn how to do this app.post request. So let's see how that works. So up here, I'm going to do that first one, which is get that body parser. And I'm going to and as we were talking about, the type we want to use is the one that can handle JSON. Okay, so now we can do a post request. So that, as we were predicting, is app.post. Then the next argument is what we're going to be what request we're going to be handling, and that is when we go to reserve. Right? So this one up here, we said when a user goes localhost 8080 hello, we do this request handler. When a user types in localhost 8080/vacancy, we do this handler. And now we say, hey, when the user types in reserve, we're going to do this one. And this is slightly different in that up here, when all the arguments were in request.query, now in a post request, all the arguments are in rec.body. So the equivalent of line 16 would be this one. And let's just do that. So let's give this a try. And now we get to a question. So how can we, it was pretty easy to add arguments in a GET request. We just did it here in the, when we were typing in the URL. But for a POST request, it has to be in the body. So we have no mechanism, easy mechanism in a browser to do this. So for this, I'll introduce a tool that I'll discuss in the next video, and that's Postman. And let me just go to that. So here I say when I go to /reserve, then I'll look at what I have in the body here. It's that URL encoded. Why did I choose URL encoded? Because here I'm saying use URL encoded body. So here are the arguments. First name, last name, campground, and sites. So let me send that request off. All right, and now let's go back here and see that it did print out the arguments. First name, last name, campground, and sites. So if I add more arguments here, like let's say I say some stupid ones like type equals camper van. Num in party, how many people are in the party, let's say, and I'll say 3 or 2. Sounds more reasonable. And now if I send that request, you'll see that all that information is printed. And Mulcairn Saddle, Sites 1, type camper van, party 2. So that's how I get information or read the information that the browser is sending me. It's in the body. It's URL encoded. And I use that argument that I showed here. I just rec.body. How do I get the first name? So here's the first name. So here's the first name appearing. First name. How do I get this and back? Well, we did it up here. Same way as we did with rec.query. We did rec.query.q. Here we do console log rec.query.first name. Right? That'll get that first name. So let's save that. Stop that. Start it. I'm going to send that request off. And it prints out that first name. So if I change the first name here, Ben, I'll cancel this request. Let me just send Ben. It prints Ben. Why is this kind of saying loading, 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 and it's not doing anything? Because I haven't returned anything. How do I return something? I do that res for response.json. So since I haven't done that in my code, it's just, this is the browser sort of just hanging there, or the browser equivalent's just hanging there waiting for some response. So let's cancel that. All right, so let's go ahead and handle that request. So I guess we don't really need this. So let's say I want all this information. So I'm going to get the first name equals rec.body.first name. And just to prove that I could call this anything, right? So let's go F name for first name. Right, because this here, rec.body dot, this argument, first name, last name, that represents a key that's being sent to us in that JSON object. These constants are just names I'm inventing. I just wanted to change them so you knew what was related to what. I guess campground. Whoop. And I guess that's all was all there. So let's just do that response, which was kind of a trivial response, given I just gave all that information I probably didn't need. So I think I said what the campground was. Oh no, I said the reservation number, didn't I? Okay, that looks good. Let's see if it works. Now let's send this back and hope for the best. So I got back reservation number 1, campground saddle. If I change it to Apache, I get reservation number 1. That's my API. It wasn't a very inventive one. Reservation number 1, campground Apache. So everything seems to work as it should. We're eliminating and hand-waving a lot of stuff, but now I think you see, hey, this isn't that hard to get a basic server running that can handle GET requests, that can handle POST requests. You learned how to get arguments for both these POST requests, how to get this information on the server and process it. That was, let me move to my code here, that was using this rec.body. Remember, in a GET request, it's not in rec.body, it's in rec.query. It's a common mistake people make that, they think there should be rec.query when it's really a POST request. So just keep in mind to keep those differences clear in your head. Next time, we'll be looking more in depth, not a big long video, but just a little bit more about this postman and why it's important to know. That should be a fairly short video. And after that, we'll finally get to integrating PostgreSQL with the stuff we just learned to get a server running that relies on databases. Really cool stuff. So I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.